You will not believe what happens to the girl at the end. Make sure to like and subscribe so we can continue writing stories like this one. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
The marriage notice. The ink bled slightly on the cheap paper, each letter of the name Hattie Higgins wavering as if unsure of its place in the world. Hattie blotted it with a scrap of worn linen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The tiny cottage, usually a haven of quiet industry, felt stifling tonight. The scent of chamomile tea, usually calming, did little to soothe her nerves. She reread the notice, her breath catching in her throat. Intending to marry Silas Blackwood of Blackwood Ranch and Hattie Higgins of this place. This place. She frowned. It sounded so pathetic. She couldn't very well put the crumbling cottage at the edge of town on a marriage notice. Blackwood Ranch. The name echoed with wealth, with power, with everything Hattie was not. She was a plump woman of simple means, known more for her apple pies than her beauty. Silas Blackwood was. Silas Blackwood. Handsome, charming, and rich as creases. She dipped the quill again, adding a line. All inquiries welcome. It was a bold move, inviting scrutiny, inviting whispers. But she needed the town to know this was real. That Silas hadn't been coerced, that she hadn't spun some fantastical tale. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, making her jump. She glanced nervously at the latch. Superstition, no doubt, but the wind always seemed to carry rumors in this town. She folded the notice carefully, smoothing the creases with her calloused fingers. It was done. Tomorrow she would face the music. The next morning dawned bright and unforgiving. Hattie dressed in her best, a simple blue dress mended countless times but clean and pressed. She braided her hair, pulling it back from her face, hoping she looked presentable. She clutched the notice in her hand as she stepped out of the cottage, the morning air crisp and cool against her flushed cheeks. The walk to town felt longer than usual. Every creak of her boots on the dusty path seemed amplified, every rustle of leaves like a mocking whisper. She could feel eyes on her, even before she reached Main Street. As she entered town, the whispers started. Faint at first, like the buzzing of distant bees, then louder, more distinct. Hattie Higgins? Getting married? To Silas Blackwood? You must be joking. He's probably lost a bet. Hattie kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her chin held high. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But the words stung, each one a tiny prick to her already fragile confidence. She passed Mrs. Abernathy's millinery shop, the window display mocking her with its elegant hats and shimmering fabrics. She imagined herself in one of those hats, walking arm in arm with Silas. The image dissolved as Martha Bellwether emerged from the shop, her eyes widening in theatrical surprise. Hattie Higgins. Well, I never. Martha's voice dripped with sugary disbelief. What brings you to town so early? Don't tell me you're finally selling those dreadful pies again. Hattie forced a smile. Just running an errand, Martha. Martha leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried halfway down the street. I heard. Well, I hardly believed it, but is it true? Are you really getting married? Hattie nodded, her grip tightening on the notice. Yes, Martha. I am. Martha gasped, clutching her chest. To Silas Blackwood. My dear Hattie, you've certainly outdone yourself. I always knew you had a certain charm. The words were laced with condescension. But Silas? He could have any woman in the territory. He chose me, Hattie said, her voice barely a whisper. Martha tittered. Well, I'm sure he has his reasons. Perhaps he needs someone to manage the ranch hand's laundry. She winked, her eyes glinting with malice. Hattie's cheeks burned. She wanted to retort, to defend herself, but she knew it was pointless. Martha thrived on drama, on gossip. Feeding her would only make things worse. She simply nodded curtly and continued her walk, leaving Martha Bellwether to cackle in her wake. The mercantile was crowded, the air thick with the scent of coffee and sawdust. Men in dusty work clothes leaned against the counter, discussing cattle prices and land disputes. Women in aprons browsed the shelves, their eyes darting nervously towards Hattie as she entered. The mercantile board, a large wooden rectangle plastered with notices, announcements, and advertisements, loomed before her. It was the town's bulletin board, its gossip mill, its public forum. This was where she would stake her claim, expose herself to the full scrutiny of the community. She approached the board, her legs feeling like lead. A group of young men near the Cracker Barrel snickered as she drew closer. One of them, a lanky cowboy with a sneer on his face, called out, "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Hattie's gonna find herself a husband." The others erupted in laughter. Hattie ignored them, focusing on the empty space on the board. She reached into her pocket for a pin, her fingers trembling so badly she almost dropped it. Another voice cut through the laughter, sharper and more pointed than the others. It was Elsie Perkins, the blacksmith's daughter, a wiry girl with a quick temper and a sharper tongue. "Leave her alone, you jackalls. Can a woman put up a notice without being harassed?" The laughter subsided, replaced by grumbling and muttered insults. Elsie glared at the men, her arms crossed defiantly. Hattie offered her a grateful smile, but Elsie just shrugged. With a deep breath, Hattie pinned the notice to the board. The cheap paper tore slightly, but it held. She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest, and looked at it. Intending to marry Silas Blackwood of Blackwood Ranch and Hattie Higgins of this place. All inquiries welcome. It was done. The words were out there for everyone to see, to judge, to ridicule. She braced herself for the storm that was sure to follow. As she turned to leave, she caught the eye of old Mr. Hemlock, the town's retired schoolteacher. He stood near the doorway, his face etched with a mixture of pity and something else. Respect. Hattie couldn't be sure. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a flicker of kindness in a sea of doubt. And for now, that was all Hattie needed. An unexpected suitor. The announcement, plastered amongst notices for lost livestock and traveling salesmen, practically vibrated with Hattie's desperation. Silas Sterling, lounging against the porch railing of the general store, almost missed it. The desert sun bleached everything a uniform pale gold, and his attention had been more focused on the glint of heat rising from the baked earth than the community bulletin. But then, a smudge of unusually large, almost frantic handwriting caught his eye. Hattie Higgins and Silas Blackwood intention to marry. Silas blinked, then pushed himself upright. He knew Hattie Higgins. Everyone knew Hattie Higgins. She was the baker's daughter, known more for her generous spirit and even more generous figure than any particular matrimonial prospects. And Silas Blackwood? That was a match as unexpected as a rainstorm in July. Blackwood was Blackwood. A man of few words and even fewer smiles, known for his ruthless efficiency in managing his sprawling ranch, and his coffers that were seemingly bottomless. Curiosity, a trait Silas's father often warned him against, propelled him inside. The general store was a cool, dim sanctuary from the sun's relentless glare. The air hung thick with the scent of cured meats, molasses, and something vaguely dusty. Hattie was there, near the back, her back to him as she examined a bolt of calico. Her shoulders seemed slumped, a subtle droop that hinted at a weariness that went beyond physical labor. Silas cleared his throat. "Miss Higgins?" Hattie startled, whirling around, her face flushing a delicate pink. "Mr. Sterling. I didn't see you there." Silas smiled, trying to radiate the easygoing charm he'd cultivated over years of navigating social expectations. "Just admiring the local news. Quite the announcement." He gestured vaguely towards the front of the store. Hattie's blush deepened. "Yes, well?" She fidgeted with the edge of the calico. "It's official, I suppose." "Blackwood," Silas mused, tilting his head slightly. "He's a formidable man." "He is," Hattie agreed, her voice barely a whisper. She avoided his gaze, her eyes fixed on the swirling pattern of the fabric. An idea, impulsive and utterly out of character, bloomed in Silas's mind. He'd always been drawn to the underdog, the overlooked, the ones everyone else seemed to dismiss. And something about Hattie's quiet resignation sparked a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. "Miss Higgins," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Forgive my boldness, but are you truly happy with this arrangement?" Hattie's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then something that looked suspiciously like hope crossed her features before being quickly extinguished. "Happy? Well, it's practical. Mr. Blackwood needs a wife, and I—" She trailed off, her voice barely audible. Silas gently took the calico from her hands and placed it back on the shelf. "And you deserve more than practical, Miss Higgins. You deserve happiness. You deserve someone who appreciates your kindness, your spirit, your—" He paused, searching for the right words, "your worth." He took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before he could fully consider the consequences. "Miss Higgins, would you consider allowing me to court you?" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Hattie stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, as if he'd just proposed a trip to the moon. "Mr. Sterling," she finally managed, her voice trembling slightly. I don't understand." "I'm serious, Miss Higgins," Silas insisted, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I know this is unconventional, but I truly believe we could be happy together. Give me a chance to prove it." Before Hattie could respond, a shrill voice cut through the stillness. "Well, I never." Martha Bellwether, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as a newly honed knife, stood a few feet away, her eyes narrowed into slits. She'd clearly been eavesdropping. "Silas Sterling," she clucked, shaking her head. "Fancy finding you here, making eyes at Hattie Higgins. I always knew you had a soft spot for the less fortunate, dear, but this is beyond the pale." Martha's words hung in the air, laced with condescension and thinly veiled amusement. Other shoppers in the store, drawn by the commotion, began to gather, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Hattie visibly shrank, her shoulders slumping once more. The brief spark of hope that had flickered in her eyes was now completely extinguished, replaced by a familiar look of resignation. Silas, however, stood his ground, his jaw set with determination. He knew he'd just thrown a social grenade into the carefully constructed hierarchy of the town, but he refused to back down. He looked directly at Martha, his voice firm and unwavering. "Martha," he said, "Miss Higgins is a kind and generous woman, and she deserves to be treated with respect. My intentions are honorable." He turned back to Hattie, ignoring the whispers and stares that surrounded them. "Miss Higgins," he said, his voice softening, "please think about what I've said. I'll call on you tomorrow." With a final, reassuring smile, Silas tipped his hat and strode out of the general store, leaving Hattie standing amidst the growing storm of gossip, her future hanging precariously in the balance. Martha Bellwether lost no time in relaying her version of the events to anyone who would listen. By sundown, the entire town was buzzing with the news of Silas Sterling's audacious proposal. The whispers spread like wildfire, fueled by speculation, disbelief, and more than a little bit of envy. Hattie Higgins, the plump, penniless baker's daughter, had somehow managed to capture the attention of the town's most eligible bachelor. It was a story too good to be true, a story that everyone was eager to dissect, analyze, and ultimately judge. The question on everyone's lips was not whether Silas Sterling was serious, but whether Hattie Higgins was foolish enough to believe him. Whispers and doubts. The saloon doors of the Rusty Spur swung back and forth, their slaps against the jam a percussive accompaniment to the swirling haze of pipe smoke. Whispers as plentiful as dust motes in a sunbeam rode each draft. "That Sterling boy, can you believe it?" Mrs. Peabody's voice, raspy as a worn file, cut through the murmur, directed at Jebediah behind the bar. He, in turn, continued his endless polishing of a glass, the rag in his hand a relic from a bygone era. A noncommittal grunt was his response. "Courting Hattie Higgins, they say. Silas Blackwood's girl, practically promised to him." He punctuated the statement with a squirt of tobacco juice into the spittoon, the metallic tang briefly silencing the room. "Says he's got intentions," Martha Bellwether boomed, her chest puffed out like a pouter pigeon, reveling in her role as newsbringer. "Saw it myself, plain as day. Right in front of the mercantile. Claimed she deserved better, mind you." A wave of conversation washed over the saloon. Some scoffed outright, some chewed on the notion, and others simply shook their heads, bewildered by the audacity. "Better?" wheezed old man Hemlock, his face etched with the deep map lines of age. "Better than Blackwood? Blackwood's got land aplenty, cattle by the head, future prospects gleaming brighter than a new coin." "True enough," agreed Jedediah, ceasing his polishing to regard the room. "What's young Sterling got besides a pretty face and a silver spoon lodged so deep he probably hawks up dimes?" The murmurs escalated, solidifying into conjecture. Was it a wager? A cruel prank to humiliate Hattie? Or, as the more suspicious patrons speculated, a cunning strategy to weaken Silas Blackwood and seize his holdings? Their ranches shared a border, and the old rivalry between the families smoldered just below the surface. "Maybe he's lost his senses," offered Lily, a young woman whose voice was barely a breath. "Hattie's, well, she's a decent soul. Always ready with a kind word." Martha Bellwether scoffed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Kindness won't buy you acreage, girl. Nor will it fill your plate when winter howls at the door." The debate intensified, fueled by speculation, gossip, and the potent liquor freely poured at the Rusty Spur. One thing was clear, Silas Sterling's brash declaration had plunged redemption into a delicious, scandalous frenzy. Across town, at the Sterling Ranch, Walter Sterling sat in his study, the sinking sun painting the room in long, somber hues. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his brow creased with concern. The news, predictably, had arrived swiftly. Martha Bellwether herself had ridden out, her eyes sparkling with self-importance. Silas entered, his usual carefree air displaced by a careful reserve. He anticipated the summons. Walter motioned towards a chair. "Sit, son." His tone was measured, controlled, but with an underlying strength that promised trouble. Silas obeyed, fixing his gaze on his father. "Hattie Higgins," Walter began, the name a weighty thing in the air. "Explain yourself." Silas hesitated, choosing his words. "As I said, father, I believe she is worthy of more than she's getting." "More?" Walter echoed, a hint of derision in his voice. "More than a secure future, a life of comfort? Blackwood may be unpolished, but he offers stability. Responsibility. He doesn't truly see her, father," Silas countered, his voice gaining force. "He sees a business arrangement. A way to enlarge his domain. Hattie deserves admiration, attention." Walter took a long draught of his whiskey. "Admiration? You barely know the woman. A few pleasantries exchanged at the mercantile, nothing of substance." "That's not accurate," Silas retorted, his hands involuntarily tightening. "I observe her when others don't. I see her fortitude, her generosity of spirit, her resilience. She warrants someone who values those qualities, not merely tolerates them." Walter leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "And you fancy yourself that someone? You who has never tasted honest labor? You who flits from one pastime to the next like a bead of blossoming flowers?" The words stung, finding their target. "I could be, father. I aspire to be. I'm weary of being perceived as frivolous." "Then demonstrate it," Walter challenged, his voice softening slightly. "Prove that this is not simply another fleeting whim." Prove that you are serious about this woman, about crafting something lasting. How? Silas asked, a thread of desperation in his voice. That, my son, is for you to discern, Walter replied, his gaze unwavering. But bear this in mind, the Blackwoods are not to be taken lightly. And the town. Redemption thrives on gossip, but it respects practicality above all else. Disrupt a sound arrangement based on nothing but a passing fancy, and you'll find yourself standing alone soon enough. Walter paused, his gaze losing some of its harshness. Consider this as well, Silas. Hattie Higgins is not a trinket to be won. She's a woman with her own desires and dreams. Treat her with reverence, with sincerity, and with a genuine heart. Otherwise, you'll not only break her heart, you'll break mine. Silas stared at his father, the weight of his words pressing down on him. His actions had been impulsive, sparked by a sudden protectiveness and a craving for something deeper. Now, he faced the fallout, the town's scrutiny, his father's disapproval, and the daunting challenge of convincing a woman he barely knew of his genuine intentions. The shadows in the study deepened, echoing the doubts that now clouded Silas's thoughts. Had he blundered terribly? Or had he finally stumbled upon something worth fighting for? The answer, he suspected, resided not in the town's idle chatter, but in the hidden chambers of his own heart. Desert courtship. Gossip trailed them like dust devils, swirling and receding with the contours of the land. Silas, perched high on Comet, his golden palomino, feigned indifference. Beside him, Hattie, less dramatically mounted on Honey, her dependable Appaloosa, appeared resigned. It'll fade, she murmured, her voice lost somewhat to the creak of saddle leather. Small-town fervor always does. A pang of guilt struck Silas. Blinded by the need to defy his father, to prove something, perhaps even to some imagined version of himself, he'd overlooked the hurricane of scrutiny his impulsive gamble had unleashed on Hattie. I'm so sorry, he said, the words laced with sincerity. I dragged you into this. Hattie's smile, a fleeting curve of her lips, tightened the knot in his stomach. It's not your doing, Silas. People thrive on chatter. Besides, she added, urging Honey forward, I'd choose this over another marathon session of hemming Mrs. Abernathy's drapes any day. The open expanse, their sanctuary, rolled before them, a sea of ochre and sage beneath an immeasurable sky that promised boundless possibilities. They rode in comfortable quiet for some time, the regular cadence of hooves a calming rhythm against the memory of wagging tongues. Remembering his father's gauntlet throne, Silas began to truly observe Hattie. He noticed the way sunlight painted burnished streaks through her chestnut hair, the quiet assurance in her grip on the reins, the subtle grace in her posture despite her less than regal mount. Had he ever really looked at Hattie Higgins before, beyond the surface? Tell me, he broke the silence, what captivates you about this place? Hattie's glance held surprise. The desert? It's everything. The stark beauty, the resilience, the sheer tenacity of life here. It's unvarnished, Silas. It makes no pretenses. She gestured toward a cluster of cacti, their spines shimmering under the sun's glare. My grandmother used to say the desert teaches you to wait. Patience for rain, for blossoms, for the coolness of shade. And when they arrive, their value is all the more profound. Pampered since birth, Silas hadn't learned the art of waiting. It was a skill he sorely lacked. Perhaps Hattie, perhaps the desert itself, could be his teacher. Their ride carried them onward, deeper into the desert's embrace, to a secluded canyon Hattie called Whispering Walls. There, wind whistling through the narrow passage produced a haunting drone, as if the very stones hummed with forgotten lore. As dusk spilled across the sky, painting it in shades of apricot and amethyst, they kindled a small fire, its flames a cheerful defiance against the encroaching darkness. Hattie unfurled a blanket and offered a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit. My grandmother, Hattie started, settling down, believed everyone carries a story within, etched as surely as rings in ancient timber. All it takes is a receptive ear. Silas felt an unfamiliar tug, a yearning to unburden himself. He usually kept his emotions under tight rein, presenting only the polished veneer expected of a sterling scion. Yet here, beneath this expansive, uncaring sky, with the wind's murmur and the fire's dance, a crack formed in that facade. My story, he confessed, his voice rasping, is hardly unique. Born to privilege, destined for a strategic marriage, tasked with continuing the family dynasty. My future was charted before I drew my first breath. Hattie's gaze met his, brimming with unexpected insight. But is that the story you wish to live, Silas? Or is there an unwritten chapter waiting? He remained silent, unable to answer. He simply didn't know. The fire dwindled, throwing animated shadows across their faces. Hattie began sharing fragments of her own life, tales of her youth, her grandmother's wisdom, the ordinary joys and understated sorrows that had shaped her. She spoke of her ambition to open a modest bakery to fill redemption with the heady scent of baking bread and sugary cinnamon. Silas listened, utterly absorbed, drawn into her world. Hattie Higgins, he realized, was more than a dowdy, overlooked spinster. She was a woman of gentle spirit, keen intellect, and an inner fortitude that belied her unassuming exterior. A woman who found beauty in the mundane, sought solace in the starkness of the desert, and clung to hope despite life's cruelties. Later, under a sky ablaze with starlight, Silas found himself divulging his own aspirations, those he normally kept locked away. He revealed his passion for architecture, his desire to create buildings that were both aesthetically pleasing and functionally sound, structures that served the community's needs. He voiced his frustration with his father's unyielding expectations, his hunger for something beyond mere wealth and influence. Hattie listened without judgment, offering only quiet encouragement. "Dreams are like desert blossoms, Silas," she murmured. "Though they appear delicate, they can thrive in the harshest conditions if offered a little sustenance and light." Looking into her eyes, Silas began to perceive Hattie not as a mere pawn, a means to an end, but as an individual, a woman with dreams of her own, a woman who might hold the key to unlocking his. He reached out, his fingers interlacing with hers. Her skin, warm and roughened, was a stark contrast to his own manicured hands. "Thank you, Hattie," he said, his voice low, "for revealing the desert to me and perhaps revealing myself." She squeezed his hand in response. "The desert has a knack for that," she replied. "It sheds the artifice and exposes what lies beneath." As they rode back to redemption beneath the moon's silvery light, Silas understood that his courtship of Hattie Higgins had become something more profound. It was no longer about proving a point or defying a parent. It was about seeking authenticity, about exploring the bond that had ignited between them, about discovering where this unexpected path might lead. The whispers of redemption still echoed, but fainter now, less significant. A sense of anticipation, a burgeoning conviction, stirred within him. He was on the cusp of something extraordinary. A simple proposal. Hattie guided Silas to a secluded hollow nestled among sandstone giants, a natural sanctuary awash in the amber hues of the setting sun. A childhood refuge, it was a place where the desert confided secrets. The air hung still, imbued with the arid, mineral scent of baked earth and the delicate, sweet aroma of cactus blossoms. Silas noticed a transformation in her, a quiet self-assurance previously unseen. "I escape here when life becomes overwhelming," she confided, her voice a bare murmur. She indicated a flattened boulder, polished by eons of wind and abrasion. "My thinking perch." Silas settled beside her, acutely conscious of the space separating them, a void bristling with unspoken longings and precarious expectations. He knew his father would be incandescent with rage at his whereabouts and intentions. Doubtless, a scathing cable awaited him back at the hotel, demanding his immediate return to salvage the sterling lineage. He pictured his father's pursed lips, the rigid line of his jaw. Yet, for the first time, the image sparked not a twinge of guilt, but a rush of defiance mingled with heady liberation. Drawing a deep breath, he felt the desert air fill his lungs, anchoring him to the present. He'd meticulously prepared a speech, carefully modulated for sincerity and dramatic flair. But gazing at Hattie, her features marked by a subtle sorrow he was only beginning to comprehend, the practiced words sounded artificial, devoid of meaning. "Hattie," he started, then faltered, the sound of his own voice disrupting the tranquility. She turned, her eyes revealing a complex tapestry of apprehension and something else, a tentative flame, hope, perhaps? Or trepidation? He couldn't be sure. He reached for her hand, his own feeling strangely awkward. Her skin was warm, roughened in places, a far cry from the delicate, manicured hands he was used to. This began on a false premise, he admitted, the words spilling out, unvarnished and unrefined. "I was trying to validate myself. To my father, mostly. But then, I truly met you." He paused, seeking the precise words to express the metamorphosis within him, the realization that Hattie was not a mere pawn, but a woman possessing remarkable resilience and understated grace. "I've acted foolishly, Hattie. Utterly, completely foolishly." He offered her hand a gentle squeeze. "I arrived armed with stratagems, calculations. They seem ludicrous now." Releasing her hand, he stood and moved a few feet away, feeling the coarse sand grind under his boots. He needed to articulate himself with genuine honesty. Turning back, his heart hammered against his ribs. "Hattie, I care for you. More deeply than I imagined possible. And I realize I'm unworthy, not after my deceitful entrance into your life. But I aspire to be. I aspire to earn your esteem." He knelt before her, the gesture feeling surprisingly natural, profoundly right. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small, intricately crafted ring. It wasn't gold or silver, adorned with gems or pearls. It was fashioned from desert wildflowers, their fragile petals interwoven into a simple, delicate band. He dedicated hours the previous day, hidden from sight, meticulously choosing and braiding the flowers, his fingers initially clumsy, gradually gaining finesse. "I can't offer you a diamond bauble, Hattie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know it's unconventional. But I created this for you. These flowers, they possess resilience, Hattie. They flourish even amidst the harshest conditions. And they are exquisite. Just like you." He extended the ring, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. "Hattie Higgins, would you grant me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not to settle a frivolous wager or to defy my father, but from your genuine desire. Because together we can cultivate something authentic." Hattie gazed at the floral ring, her eyes widening in disbelief. Tears welled, clouding her vision. She blinked, but more followed, cascading down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. Silas, she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. He waited, his breath trapped, the silence stretching, heavy and profound. He detected a shadow of hesitancy in her gaze, a remnant of the past, the countless instances of feeling invisible, of being deemed inadequate, of being a spectacle in the mercantile. But beneath that apprehension he perceived something else, a nascent hope, a fragile possibility. "You are free to decline," he added quickly. "If your heart isn't willing, I would understand. I've hardly given you grounds for trust." Yet, even as he spoke, he desperately wished for her acceptance, more passionately than anything he had ever craved. He yearned to devote his life to dispelling the doubts in her eyes, to prove himself worthy. She reached out, her fingertips grazing his. The contact sent a current through him. She accepted the flower ring, her touch surprisingly tender. She examined the ring, then met his gaze, her eyes brimming with a confluence of joy and wonder. "Yes, Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I will." He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief cascaded over him so intense it nearly buckled his knees. He rose, drawing her up with him, and enveloped her in his arms, holding her close. She nestled her face against his chest, sobbing gently. He held her tightly, feeling the warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her heart. He understood this was only the genesis. He knew his father would disapprove. He knew obstacles lay ahead, challenges to surmount, moments of uncertainty to navigate. But in that instant, holding Hattie close, surrounded by the hushed magnificence of the desert, he felt prepared to confront anything. Because he had discovered something genuine, something true, something worthy of his unwavering commitment. Lifting her chin, he gently brushed away her tears. He met her gaze, seeing not the quiet resignation he'd noticed previously, but a nascent spark, a bright bloom of optimism. He bent and kissed her. A tender, lingering kiss that whispered of promises and new horizons. As he kissed her, he knew their story was simply beginning. A story just unfolding, with the promise to endure. A skeptical wedding. Hattie stared at her reflection, or rather, the distorted image staring back from the small, cracked mirror above the mercantile. The dress, a simple cream-colored cotton she'd sewn herself, hung a little too loosely now. She'd been losing weight, not from joy, but from a knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. "Nearly time, dear," Mrs. Abernathy called from the back of the mercantile. The older woman had been surprisingly kind, offering the small space behind the counter for Hattie to prepare. "You look lovely." The hesitation was palpable. Lovely wasn't a word often associated with Hattie Higgins. Plump, plain, practical, those were the adjectives that usually came to mind. But today, even she had to admit, she looked different. The loose dress, the nervous energy, the faint smudge of kohl Mrs. Abernathy had insisted on applying to her eyelids. It all combined to create something almost fragile. Outside, she could hear the murmur of voices. Not a joyous buzz, but a low, susurrant hum, like wasps circling a discarded apple. She knew what they were saying. She'd heard it all before, in whispers and pointed silences. Silas Sterling, the golden boy, marrying Hattie Higgins? It was absurd. A joke. A scandal. She took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of panic. Silas had been insistent. He'd sworn his feelings were real. He'd even proposed with a wildflower ring right there in the desert under a sky full of stars. But doubt, a familiar companion, lingered. The music started, a scratchy rendition of a hymn played on a battered fiddle. It was time. The walk to the small clearing behind the church felt like an eternity. She kept her eyes fixed on the dusty ground, avoiding the stares of the gathered townsfolk. Martha Bellwether, perched on a nearby crate, surveyed the scene with undisguised glee, her lips pursed in a knowing smirk. Hattie knew she would be the first to spread any juicy tidbits of gossip. Silas was waiting beneath a makeshift arch adorned with desert flowers. He looked uncomfortable. His usual easy charm seemed strained, replaced by a nervous fidgeting. His tailored suit, usually impeccable, looked rumpled. As Hattie drew closer, she saw a sheen of sweat on his brow. His father, Walter Sterling, stood rigidly to one side, his face a mask of disapproval. His eyes, sharp and cold, bored into Silas with a palpable disappointment. The preacher, a wizened old man with a trembling voice, began the ceremony. His words felt hollow, echoing in the tense silence. Hattie barely registered them, her mind racing. Was she making a terrible mistake? Was Silas truly sincere, or was this all some elaborate game? When the preacher reached the point where he asked if anyone objected, Hattie held her breath. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging, questioning. No one spoke. The preacher cleared his throat and continued. Silas's hand, when he took hers, was clammy. "I do," Hattie heard herself say. The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Walter Sterling looked surprised. Silas's grip tightened on her hand. He squeezed gently. "Hattie," he whispered, his eyes pleading. She looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything, to confirm his sincerity. She saw fear, and something else, a vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. She took a shaky breath. "I do," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. This time it was a choice. The ceremony concluded quickly. Silas kissed her, a brief, awkward peck on the cheek. The townsfolk applauded politely, but the sound lacked genuine warmth. The reception was even more strained. A few tables had been set up with meager offerings of biscuits and lemonade. Most people kept their distance, whispering amongst themselves. Walter Sterling approached Silas, his voice low and cutting. Hattie couldn't hear the words, but she saw the anger on his face, the sharp gestures. Silas stood his ground, but his shoulders were slumped, his expression defeated. Martha Bellwether cornered Hattie, her eyes gleaming. Well, she purred. "Never thought I'd see the day. You've certainly landed yourself a prize, dear. But can you keep him? That's the question, isn't it?" Hattie forced a smile. "Only time will tell, Martha." She spotted Silas across the clearing, his gaze fixed on her. He excused himself from his father and walked toward her, his expression unreadable. As he approached, Hattie realized something. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with her head held high. She had nothing to lose and everything to prove. To herself and perhaps to the skeptical townsfolk who doubted her worth. And maybe, just maybe, to Silas Sterling, the man she had just married. Trouble on the ranch. Silas spat a curse, each stride on the dusty trail kicking up a miniature whirlwind of frustration. He'd been on the herd's trail for what felt like an eternity, an icy premonition solidifying in his stomach. 10 gone. Not merely wandered off, but vanished. Swallowed whole by the immense Sterling ranch as if the very earth had claimed them. He halted Apache on a rise, his gaze sweeping the horizon. The sun, a malevolent eye in the sky, blazed down, turning the already arid landscape into a shimmering illusion. Miles stretched before him, yet offered no clue, no sign of the missing steers. No plume of dust betraying their passage, absolutely nothing. Only the implacable, unending plains. "Damn it all to hell," he grumbled, dismounting. He knelt, sifting the dry soil through his fingers, seeking some indication of their passing. A snapped twig, a scuffed patch of ground, anything. He discovered only the familiar prints of his own cattle, a trail that dissolved into nothing. As twilight painted the sky in fiery hues, Silas reluctantly steered Apache back toward the ranch. The thought of facing Walter Sterling's wrath churned his gut. His father had always regarded his choices with skepticism, and this setback would only confirm Walter's dim view. He found Walter on the porch, his silhouette rocking rhythmically against the fading light, a rifle cradled in his arms. The sight offered a strange mix of reassurance and apprehension. Walter Sterling was a man of few words, yet his presence resonated like thunder. "They're gone," Pa Silas announced, his voice weighed down with defeat. 10 head. Disappeared. Walter's rocking stopped, his gaze hardening into flint. "Gone? Explain yourself." "Just that. Not a trace. No sign they left the property. Like they simply ceased to exist." Walter rose, his movements deliberate despite his age. "Show me." They retraced Silas's path toward the vanishing point, the long shadows of the setting sun twisting familiar shapes into grotesque parodies. Walter scrutinized the ground, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He remained silent, but Silas felt his father's judgment like a tangible burden. Finally, Walter straightened, his face etched with displeasure. "This is no accident, Silas. Someone's poaching, plain as day. But who? And how did they move 10 head without leaving a single mark? That's what we aim to discover." Walter turned toward the ranch house, his voice clipped with anger. "Rouse the men. We ride at dawn." The following day broke clear and bright, yet the air crackled with suppressed tension. Silas and Walter, accompanied by 4 ranch hands, fanned out in different directions, each searching for any clue to the missing cattle. Silas took the eastern range, the once familiar landscape now seeming hostile and foreign. By midday, their efforts had yielded nothing. Discouraged, Silas paused to let Apache drink at the creek bisecting the eastern pasture. As the horse drank, Silas noticed an anomaly. The water's surface shimmered with an unnatural, oily sheen, an iridescent film that twisted the sunlight into rainbows. He dismounted, crouching by the water's edge. He cupped some of the water in his hand, bringing it to his nose. The scent was subtle but undeniably recognizable, kerosene. "Damn them," he hissed, spitting on the dusty bank. Someone had poisoned the water supply. He swung back onto Apache, urging him toward the ranch at a reckless pace, his mind ablaze with possibilities. This was no longer merely about stolen cattle. This was a calculated assault intended to cripple the Sterling Ranch. He found Walter overseeing repairs to a section of damaged fencing. Leaping from Apache, Silas raced toward his father. "Pa, the creek. It's been poisoned. Someone's dumped kerosene in it." The news darkened Walter's already grim expression. "Poisoned? Are you certain? I smelled it myself. It's undrinkable." Walter swore, an infrequent outburst that underscored the severity of the situation. "This is escalating. Someone is trying to force us off our land." That evening, the ranch hands congregated in the main room, their faces etched with worry. The atmosphere was charged, thick with unspoken suspicions. Walter stood before them, his voice low but resolute. "Someone on this ranch is aiding them," he declared, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "Someone knows more than they are revealing." Caleb Finch, a young hand eager for recognition, shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Walter's piercing stare, his hands fidgeting nervously. He'd always felt invisible, insignificant, a mere cog in the Sterling Ranch's machinery. Walter continued, "I expect everyone to be vigilant. Report anything out of the ordinary. We must expose those responsible before they destroy everything we have built." Silas watched Caleb, a seed of suspicion taking root in his mind. Caleb was perpetually striving to prove his worth, to gain approval. But his current unease seemed out of proportion. Later that night, sleep eluded Silas. He paced restlessly in his room, his thoughts swirling. Who would seek to harm the Sterling Ranch? And what was their motive? He pictured Hattie, secure in town, and felt a wave of fierce protectiveness. He knew he had to end this, not only for his family but for their shared future. He refused to allow anyone to jeopardize their dreams. Suspicions and secrets. Blackwood, Walter spat the name like a mouthful of alkali dust. "He's always coveted this land, always grumbled about our water rights. It's him, Silas. I'll wager my best mare on it." Silas rubbed his jaw, the stubble scratching against his palm. He wanted to believe it. Jedediah Blackwood was an easy target, a known quantity, a man driven by petty greed. But something felt off, a discordant note in the symphony of suspicion. "We need proof, Pa. Can't just ride over there and accuse him without a shred of evidence." Walter's eyes, the color of weathered granite, narrowed. "Evidence? The poisoned water trough ain't evidence enough? 10 head of prime steer vanishing into thin air? The man's practically waving a flag, Silas." Hattie, who had been quietly pouring coffee, set a mug before Silas. The clinking of the porcelain seemed loud in the tense silence. She hadn't spoken much since the discovery, her usual easy banter replaced by a quiet apprehension. But she had been watching, absorbing, her keen eyes missing nothing. "Perhaps," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "perhaps we should look closer to home first." Walter snorted. "What are you suggesting, Hattie? That one of my men would betray me." "I'm not suggesting anything, Walter," she replied, a surprising steel entering her tone. "Just that desperation can make people do strange things. And sometimes the loudest bark comes from the dog with the most to hide." Silas studied her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Hattie possessed a quiet wisdom, a perspective born from years of being underestimated and overlooked. She saw the nuances that others missed, the subtle shifts in behavior that betrayed hidden anxieties. He turned to Walter. "Hattie's right, Pa. We can't rule anything out. We need to watch the men, see if anyone's acting different." The tension in the air remained thick as Walter reluctantly agreed. He was a man of action, used to facing his enemies head-on. This waiting, this subtle observation went against his very nature. As Silas and Walter began to discuss potential strategies, Hattie slipped out of the house. The sun was high, beating down on the parched earth. The air shimmered with heat, and the scent of sagebrush hung heavy in the air. She walked towards the bunkhouse, her gaze sweeping over the ranch hands as they went about their chores. Caleb Finch, the youngest of the crew, was mending a fence, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He kept glancing nervously towards the main house, his brow furrowed in what appeared to be worry. She'd always considered Caleb a bit simple, easily led, but now she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, fear, perhaps, or guilt. Further away, old Jebediah, the ranch's cook, was scrubbing pots outside the cookhouse. He was whistling a tuneless melody, his face placid. But Hattie noticed his hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, were trembling slightly as he scrubbed. She paused, remembering her grandmother's teachings. The desert, her grandmother had said, whispers secrets to those who listen. The wind carries tales, the sand holds memories, and the creatures of the land know more than they let on. Hattie had always dismissed it as old wives' tales. But now, standing in the heart of Sterling Ranch, she felt a strange connection to the land. A sense that it was trying to tell her something. She remembered her grandmother showing her how to read the desert, the way the shadows fell, the tracks in the sand, the behavior of the animals. It was a skill she had largely forgotten, buried beneath years of societal expectations and stifled dreams. She walked towards the water trough, the one that had been poisoned. The water had been drained, but a faint residue remained. a dark stain on the wood. She knelt, carefully examining the ground around it. There were tracks, of course, boot prints and hoof prints, but nothing that stood out. Except, she spotted a small, almost invisible indentation in the dust, a mark too precise to be made by a random footstep. It was the impression of a tool, something small and metallic, perhaps a syringe? Her heart pounded in her chest. If someone had used a syringe to inject the poison into the water, it meant they had access to the poison in a concentrated form. And that, in turn, suggested a level of knowledge and planning that Jedediah Blackwood, with his blustering threats and clumsy attempts at sabotage, simply didn't possess. This was something more insidious, something that burrowed deep within the heart of Sterling Ranch. She stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt. She knew she had to tell Silas what she had found, but she also knew that she couldn't trust everyone. She had to be careful, had to choose her words wisely. As she walked back towards the house, she noticed Caleb Finch watching her from across the yard. He quickly averted his gaze, but not before she saw the fear in his eyes again, a fear that seemed to mirror her own. The desert had whispered its secrets, and Hattie had finally begun to listen. The hunt for the saboteur had begun in earnest, not with accusations and threats, but with quiet observation and a growing sense of unease. The enemy was not at the gates, but within. Dismissed doubts. The aroma of wood smoke clung to Silas's coat as he entered the kitchen, his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than the day's labor. Hattie was already there, a steaming mug in her hands, the lamplight softening the worry lines around her eyes. "Silas, you look exhausted," she said, her voice a gentle caress. He sank into a chair, gratefully accepting the mug. "It's been a long day. Walter's convinced it's Jedediah. Swears he saw him lurking near the north fence line a few weeks back." Hattie's brow furrowed. "Walter sees Jedediah behind every tumbleweed these days. Silas, I think we should be looking closer to home." Silas took a long swallow of coffee, the warmth doing little to thaw the chill in his bones. "What do you mean?" Hattie hesitated, gathering her thoughts. "I told you about the syringe mark I found near the trough, didn't I? It wasn't just a careless accident, Silas. It was deliberate. And yesterday when I was checking the south pasture, I saw Caleb Finch acting strange." Silas chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Caleb? Strange?" "Hattie, Caleb's always a little strange. He's just a kid, nervous around horses, probably more comfortable with a book than a branding iron. It was more than just nervousness, Silas. He was near the tack room, fiddling with something behind his back. When I called out to him, he jumped, practically dropped whatever he was holding. And he wouldn't look me in the eye. He mumbled something about checking the saddle blankets and hurried off." Silas shook his head, his expression softening. "Hattie, I appreciate you trying to help, but you're letting your imagination run wild. Caleb's been with us since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His father worked this ranch before him. They're Sterling men through and through. Loyal to a fault." Hattie's shoulders slumped slightly. "But Silas." "No buts, Hattie. I know these men. They've worked alongside me, sweated beside me, bled beside me. I trust them with my life. I won't have you accusing them based on a feeling." The fire in the hearth crackled, the only sound in the room. Hattie looked at Silas, her eyes searching his. She saw not suspicion, not even doubt, but a stubborn, unyielding faith in the men he'd known his whole life. A faith that seemed impenetrable. "You're dismissing this," she said quietly, the words heavy with disappointment. "I'm being realistic, Hattie. We're facing a serious threat. We can't afford to chase shadows based on hunches. We need solid proof, not whispered suspicions." Hattie stood up, her mug clinking softly against the table. "And where will you find that proof, Silas? While you're looking in the wrong direction." She walked to the window, gazing out at the darkened landscape. The ranch house stood silhouetted against the stardusted sky, a beacon of warmth and safety. But Hattie felt a growing unease, a sense of isolation that chilled her to the bone. "My grandmother used to say that the most dangerous snakes are the ones hidden in the grass," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones you don't see coming." Silas sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Hattie, please. Don't do this. I'm already dealing with enough pressure from my father and the townsfolk. I don't need you adding to it with unfounded accusations." He stood and walked towards her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "I know you're trying to protect me, protect us, and I appreciate it. But trust me on this. I know these men. They wouldn't betray me." Hattie turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And what if you're wrong, Silas? What if your trust is misplaced? What will happen then?" Silas pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I won't be wrong," he murmured, his voice thick with conviction. "I can't be." But as he held her, Hattie couldn't shake the feeling that Silas was clinging to a belief, not a certainty. A belief that was blinding him to the danger lurking within his own ranch, within his own circle of trust. And she, the outsider, the woman he'd plucked from obscurity, was the only one who could see it. But her voice, it seemed, was not enough to penetrate the wall of loyalty and tradition that surrounded him. She felt a profound loneliness settle upon her, a sense of being unheard, unseen, in the very place she was beginning to call home. Her grandmother's wisdom echoed in her mind, a stark warning against the perils of blind faith and the devastating consequences of ignoring the whispers of intuition. Caught in the act, the desert night enveloped her, a heavy, hushed presence broken only by the cricket's cadence and a distant coyote's lament. Cloaked in a smoke-tinged shawl, Hattie remained concealed behind a knot of scrub, well apart from the central water source. The moon, a mere crescent in the vast expanse, cast just enough light to discern shapes, painting the terrain in muted tones. A need to roam, she'd excused to Silas, claiming insomnia. Partially true. Restlessness tormented her, undoubtedly, but it was compounded by a creeping premonition, the conviction that something dreadful loomed. Kind-hearted Silas, so trusting, had simply squeezed her hand, suggesting a stroll, a breath of night air. He remained oblivious, his vision clouded by years of camaraderie. Hours bled into one another with agonizing slowness. A frigid touch began to numb her, despite the shawl's meager warmth. Just as she considered retreating, dismissing the night as a figment of her anxious mind, she spotted him. Caleb Finch. He moved with an unexpected stealth for a man his age, a dark form etched against the paler ground. A small sack dangled from his fingers, its contents shielded by the gloom. He neared the well, eyes darting about with a skittishness that betrayed his purpose. Hattie's breath caught in her throat. The moment had arrived. Caleb, back turned, knelt at the wellhead. A faint chime of metal against metal reached her ears, the grating sound of something forced. Her heart hammered, a frantic tattoo against the stillness. He was tampering with the well. Of that, she had no doubt. A jolt of adrenaline surged through her, chasing away the fatigue and chill. She had to intervene. She couldn't allow him to poison the lifeblood of the ranch, to endanger Silas. Slowly, deliberately, she emerged from her hiding place. Caleb? Her voice, barely a whisper, struggled against the chorus of crickets. He stopped, every muscle tense. Then, with surprising agility, he spun around, his face a canvas of shock mixed with something else. Fear? Guilt, perhaps? The sack slipped from his grasp, scattering dark granules onto the parched earth. Hattie needed no expert to identify them. Rodenticide. Hattie, he stammered, his voice rough. What are you doing out here? A question I was about to pose to you, Caleb, she replied, her voice gathering resolve. She moved closer, her gaze pinned to the spilled poison. What is that? He offered no answer, his eyes flicking about, seeking an escape. Rat poison, isn't it? She pressed, her tone hardening. You were contaminating the well. Explain yourself. He recoiled, his shoulders sagging. He suddenly seemed older, the lines on his face deepened by worry. It's not what it seems, he mumbled unconvincingly. Then enlighten me, Caleb, she demanded, shortening the distance. Tell me why you're poisoning our water. He sighed, a prolonged, defeated sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and she glimpsed something new in his eyes, desperation. I didn't want to do this, Hattie, he confessed, his voice a bare thread. I swear. Then who did? She asked sharply. Who instructed you to do this? He hesitated, his lips tightening into a thin line. He glanced around again, his eyes skittering nervously. I can't, he finally choked out. I can't tell you. You must, Caleb, she pleaded, her voice laced with urgency. This transcends you. This is about the ranch, about Silas, about everyone who depends on that water. He closed his eyes briefly, as if summoning courage. When he opened them, his gaze was steady, resigned. There's someone else, he revealed. Someone is paying me. Who? Hattie demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who's paying you to poison us? He swallowed hard. I don't know his name, he admitted. He never gave it. He contacted me, offered me a deal I couldn't refuse. Said he had a silent partner. A silent partner? Hattie echoed, her thoughts racing. What does that mean? I don't know, Caleb admitted with a shake of his head. Only that there were others, people keen to see Sterling Ranch fail. And why would they want such a thing? Hattie insisted. Caleb shrugged. He didn't elaborate. Just that it was business of some kind. Hattie fixed him with a stare, trying to decipher the truth. A masked conspirator, someone desiring the downfall of Sterling Ranch. Who could harbor such animosity? And why? What were your instructions? She pressed. Exactly what were you supposed to do? I was to foul the water supply, Caleb divulged, his voice thick with shame. Render it unusable. He supplied me with this poison. Said it would take time, but eventually the ranch would become a wasteland. People would be forced to leave. And what inducement did he offer? Hattie asked, her tone laced with danger. Money, Caleb confessed. Enough to disappear. Start fresh, somewhere new. Hattie felt a wave of fury, burning and intense. He was prepared to condemn them all simply for financial gain. You were willing to let everyone suffer? She asked, her voice trembling with outrage. Caleb hung his head, consumed by remorse. I didn't think it would truly hurt anyone, he mumbled. I imagined. I don't know what I imagined. I was desperate. Hattie drew in a deep breath, fighting to regain control. Anger wouldn't unearth the truth. She needed information. Where did you meet him? She probed. When did he first reach out? Caleb tarried, then sighed. About a month ago, he said. A letter arrived. Instructed me to meet him at the derelict mill on the edge of town. We met a few times following that, always cloaked in secrecy. Did you see his face? Hattie questioned. No, Caleb affirmed, shaking his head. He always wore a mask. A black mask that concealed his entire face. A shiver traced Hattie's spine. A black mask. A silent partner. This was far more complex than she had initially suspected. A sinking feeling told her that this confrontation was merely the prelude to something far more sinister. A risky plan. The coppery reek of blood stung Hattie's nostrils. Caleb, sweat plastering his hair to a face contorted with dread, possessed a surprising reservoir of strength. Another kick, aimed for her midsection, came hurtling toward her. Years spent lugging buckets and outmaneuvering poultry had gifted her with unexpected nimbleness. She danced aside, seizing his wrist and wrenching it. A sharp cry escaped him as he stumbled backward. Who's paying you, Caleb? She pressed, her voice a dangerous murmur. Spill it. What's their angle? Yours. He merely shook his head, tears brimming. I can't, they'll kill me. A branch snapped beyond the ring of trees shielding the well. Silas. He'd heard the ruckus. A wave of relief washed over Hattie, swiftly curdling into fresh anxiety. Silas was ignorant of the poison in the well. He'd charge him without thinking. Which he promptly did. He exploded from the trees, his features a stormy mask. Hattie. You okay? He launched himself at Caleb, sending him sprawling. Desperate, Caleb clawed for the shovel, his tool for sabotage. Silas ripped it from his grasp and flung it aside. They wrestled in the dirt, Silas's raw power gradually dominating. Silas, no. Hattie shouted, her voice constricted with fear. He's been poisoning the well. Don't touch him. But her warning arrived a beat too late. Trapped beneath Silas, Caleb's boot shot out, connecting with Silas's temple. Silas grunted, momentarily dazed, and Caleb exploited the opening, wriggling free and darting away, vanishing into the encroaching twilight. Silas lay motionless for a heartbeat, then groaned, pushing himself up on his elbows. A crimson line trickled from a cut near his hairline. Silas. Hattie scrambled to his side, kneeling beside him. Are you hurt bad? He blinked, his gaze unfocused. Caleb. What happened? He's gone, Hattie said, applying her handkerchief to the wound. He was contaminating the well with rodenticide. Said someone hired him for it. Silas cursed under his breath. He sat up stiffly, wincing. Damn. Should have heeded you. He looked at her, his eyes mirroring a blend of pain and remorse. You were right from the get-go, weren't you? Hattie didn't reply, preoccupied with assessing his injury. Superficial, but bleeding freely. We need to get you inside, she stated firmly. This needs tending. She helped him stand, supporting him as they limped toward the ranch house. The air was thick with the scent of pine mingling with the harsh chemical tang of the poison. Inside, Hattie settled Silas in a chair and began to treat the gash. Her movements were swift and precise, yet gentle. Silas observed her, a contemplative expression on his face. So, someone paid Caleb to ruin our water supply, he said, breaking the silence. Who stands to gain from this? Hattie dampened a fresh cloth in the water-filled basin. That's what we have to discover. He alluded to a masked man and a silent partner. Silas leaned back, closing his eyes. A silent partner suggests influence. Someone wanting to maintain distance from the deed. Hattie finished cleansing the cut and started to bandage it. Exactly. And Caleb was petrified. Whoever is behind this, they exert considerable leverage over him. We need to find him, Silas insisted, his voice regaining strength. Make him confess. Hattie shook her head. No. He's too terrified. He won't reveal anything willingly. And even if he did, it would be his word against theirs. We need concrete evidence. Silas opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. What's your play then? Hattie paused, considering. An idea sparked in her mind, a daring gambit that could unmask the architect of this plot. We need to convince them they are winning, she said in a low voice. We need to coax them out into the light. How? Silas asked, intrigued. We broadcast that the ranch is crumbling, Hattie explained, a spark of determination in her eyes. That the poisoned well has decimated our water, that the livestock is failing, that we're teetering on the brink of ruin. We spread the news far and wide. Then we wait. Observe who arrives to claim their victory. Silas stared at her, his expression a complex blend of admiration and concern. That's a high-stakes game, Hattie. It could backfire. What if they recognize the trap? It's a risk we must embrace, Hattie countered, her tone unwavering. We can't allow them to continue sabotaging the ranch, imperiling our livelihood. We have to put a stop to it permanently. She met Silas's gaze directly. Are you with me? Silas hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then he nodded. I'm with you, he pledged, his voice resolute. Whatever the cost. Exposed. The grit of the parched earth coated Hattie's tongue like a bitter premonition. With deliberate force, she towed up a miniature dust devil as they entered the mercantile, embodying a woman resigned to misfortune. Silas followed, his normally buoyant gait reduced to a listless drag, shoulders conveying defeat. They needed an audience, and Mrs. Peabody, notorious for her loose lips, offered the perfect sounding board. "Mornin', Mrs. Peabody," Hattie offered, her tone weighed down with fabricated weariness. "Just tacking up a notice." A hastily scrawled message met the corkboard. "Sterling ranch horses, tools, and livestock. Must sell." The ink glistened. Behind her spectacles, Mrs. Peabody's eyes ballooned. "Hattie! Silas! Whatever is the meaning of this?" Silas heaved a sigh, raking a hand through his already ruffled hair. "It's dire, Mrs. Peabody. Truly dire. This poisoned well. It scared off every cattle buyer within 100 miles. Nobody wants sterling beef anymore. Banks are clamoring for payment. We're hemorrhaging money." Hattie amplified, her voice barely audible. "We're just trying to salvage what we can. Perhaps get enough to relocate." She detected a fleeting pity in Mrs. Peabody's gaze, swiftly overtaken by morbid fascination. The rumor would erupt like a prairie fire. They replayed their roles throughout the day at the blacksmith's forge, the saloon where Silas begrudgingly bought a round for any sympathetic ear, even outside the church following evening prayers. Walter Sterling, initially enraged by the deceptive performance, eventually relented, recognizing it as their best avenue, though he kept a sharp eye on Silas, clearly harboring suspicions beyond apprehending a saboteur. "You positive about this, son?" he'd rasped, his voice rough-edged. They stood in the ranch house, a map of Sterling spread between them. Hattie had retreated, feigning to grant them privacy, but remained within earshot. "It's the only path, Pa," Silas responded, his voice steady under his father's intense scrutiny. "We draw him out or we forfeit everything." By the third day, the town's air hung thick with a blend of commiseration and cruel delight. Hattie caught fragments of conversations, mutters about Silas's rashness, gloomy forecasts of the Sterling family's ruin, and barely concealed triumph at Silas Sterling's humiliation. It stung, yet Hattie reminded herself it was all a calculated gambit. Then the summons arrived. A curt message delivered by a boy, "Meet at the old mill. Sundown. No attribution." Silas read it aloud, a flinty gratification in his eyes. "He's bitten." As the sun sank, staining the sky in hues of fire and plum, Hattie and Silas guided their horses toward the derelict mill. The air stood still, brimming with suspense. Inside the decaying structure, shadows cavorted like accomplices. Elias Thorne stood waiting, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. He was impeccably attired, as usual, his manner conveying a veneer of quiet dignity that concealed the heart of darkness beneath. "Silas," Thorne greeted, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Hattie, I was troubled to learn of your misfortunes." "Troubled?" Silas spat, dripping with contempt. "Is that what you name it, Thorne? Watching us unravel." Thorne's expression didn't flinch. "I merely recognized an opportunity. Sterling land is considerable. I was prepared to tender a generous offer, considering the situation." Hattie advanced, narrowing her gaze. "A generous offer? Or a mere song, Thorne? Exploiting our desperation?" Thorne emitted a soft chuckle. "Let's simply say mutually advantageous. You eliminate your debts and I increase my holdings." He paused, then tacked on, "A pity about the well. Such unfortunate happenstance." That was the pivot. As if orchestrated, the townsfolk materialized from the surrounding foliage, their faces set with grim resolve, their eyes blazing with ire and disillusionment. Walter Sterling spearheaded the advance, his rifle gripped firmly. "Elias Thorne," Walter's voice thundered, vibrating through the mill. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit sabotage and attempted murder." Thorne's sang-froid shattered. His eyes frantically scanned for an escape. "This is preposterous. I have done nothing." But the evidence was insurmountable. Caleb Finch, looking ashen and terrified, was dragged forward, his hands bound. "Tell them, Caleb," Hattie instructed, her voice icy. "Tell them who reimbursed you to contaminate our well." Caleb wavered, his eyes pleading with Thorne. But Thorne remained mute, his face a rigid mask of simmering rage. "Tell them." Walter bellowed, shaking Caleb harshly. Finally Caleb crumbled. "It was him. Mr. Thorne. He paid me handsomely to spoil the water. He told me it was just to give you a scare, make you sell cheap." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Thorne's face flushed crimson. "Lies," he screamed. "Pure lies. This is a plot. I'm being set up." But no one believed him. The townspeople had pierced his disguise. They had witnessed his greed, his heartlessness. They had been charmed by his facade for too long. As the sheriff stepped forward to cuff Thorne, Hattie felt a wave of weariness consume her. The deception had paid off. They had unveiled the architect. But she knew deep down that this was not closure. There were other participants, others who had thrived amidst the turmoil at Sterling Ranch. and she wouldn't rest until they were all brought to justice. Partners forever. Dust devils danced around Thorne's polished boots as Sheriff Brody escorted him away, his face a volcanic eruption of thwarted ambition. The public shaming hung heavy, a miasma thicker than the humid air. Thorne's elaborate house of cards, constructed with lies and avarice, lay scattered, its fraudulent nature exposed for all to see. He shot one last viperous look at Silas, then at Hattie, before being unceremoniously bundled into the sheriff's wagon. A charged stillness blanketed the townsfolk. They'd anticipated a dramatic downfall for Sterling Ranch, confirmation of their own whispered suspicions and envious barbs. Instead, they'd been witness to elaborate treachery revealed and a charlatan unmasked. Silas moved forward, his gaze sweeping over the observing faces. Hattie stood a step behind, feeling the weight of their communal appraisal. This time, though, it held a new quality. Mixed with the lingering distrust was a glimmer of respect. "Many of you," Silas began, his voice now a clarion call, "questioned my relationship with Hattie. You deemed her an interloper, a woman out of place. You looked at Sterling Ranch as vulnerable prey, easy pickings." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. "You misjudged." He turned to Hattie, clasping her hand. Her fingers, roughened by labor, felt steadfast and capable in his. It was Hattie's astute intellect, her unwavering grit, that unearthed Thorne's scheme. It was her courage that secured his confession. He lifted their joined hands. "She saved Sterling Ranch. She saved us all." A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. Some faces remained impassive, unconvinced. Others, however, betrayed a spark of dawning recognition, a reluctant admiration. Even Walter Sterling, who had stood rigidly at the periphery, offered a terse nod of acknowledgement. "From this point onward," Silas declared, his voice resolute, "Hattie is not just my wife, but my equal partner. In this ranch, in this life, in everything we do." He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers with unwavering devotion. "She is Sterling Ranch." The crowd slowly began to disperse, the palpable tension gradually easing. The whispers, though still audible, now carried a different timbre, tinged with curiosity and a touch of awe. A warmth bloomed within Hattie, a sense of belonging she'd never known. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, splashing the sky with vibrant shades of flame and lavender, Hattie and Silas stood together on their porch. The air carried the pungent scent of sagebrush and the distant, comforting sounds of cattle lowing. "They'll come around," Silas reassured, breaking the peaceful quiet. He leaned against the railing, watching the last embers of sunlight fade. "It'll take time, but they'll understand." Hattie stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the vast expanse of land before them. "It doesn't matter," she murmured, "as long as we have each other." Silas turned to her, his gaze filled with heartfelt affection. "Partners always?" Hattie smiled, her heart overflowing with affection. "Partners always." The following weeks unfolded in a blur of activity. With Thorne removed from the equation, the immediate danger to Sterling Ranch had been averted. But the scars he had inflicted, both on the land and on the community's spirit, persisted. The well needed rigorous cleansing and testing. Fences required mending. And above all, trust needed to be painstakingly rebuilt. Silas and Hattie worked in concert, their partnership deepening with each challenge they confronted. Together, they repaired damaged fences, their movements flowing with practiced efficiency. They supervised the decontamination of the well, ensuring every trace of poison was eradicated. They collaborated on business decisions, each valuing the other's perspectives and insights. Hattie, once relegated to the margins, now found herself at the center of the ranch's daily life. Her knowledge of finance and her sharp eye for detail proved indispensable in streamlining their accounts and identifying areas for improvement. Silas, in turn, came to appreciate her quiet fortitude and unwavering commitment. The townsfolk, initially wary, began to approach them with a newfound respect. They saw Hattie not as an outsider, but as a competent and intelligent woman who was helping to revitalize Sterling Ranch. They saw Silas not as a feckless heir, but as a man who had discovered his true purpose in the land and in his wife. Even Walter Sterling, initially dubious of Hattie's capabilities, began to solicit her counsel on matters concerning the ranch's operations. He recognized in her a dedication and a practicality that echoed his own younger years. He even, on one occasion, offered her a gruff compliment, a gesture that spoke volumes about his evolving opinion. One afternoon, while Hattie and Silas were in the fields repairing a section of damaged fencing, a group of children tentatively approached. Their eyes were wide with curiosity and hesitant anticipation. "Mr. Sterling," one of the boys asked, his voice barely audible, "can we help?" Silas grinned, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Of course you can," he replied. "Grab those hammers and come join us." Hattie watched as the children enthusiastically pitched in, their small hands wielding the tools with earnest effort. She felt a surge of hope blossom within her, a conviction that Sterling Ranch was not only being restored, but was also being reintegrated into the heart of the community. As the sun began its descent, casting long, stretching shadows across the fields, Hattie and Silas walked back toward the house, the children trailing happily behind. The air was filled with the sounds of cheerful laughter and the steady rhythm of hammering. "We're not finished yet," Hattie said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Thorn was just the tip of the iceberg. There are others involved, I can feel it." Silas nodded, his expression hardening. "I know," he said. "We'll find them. Together." They reached the porch of their home, the familiar silhouette of Sterling Ranch stark against the darkening sky. Hattie paused, absorbing the scene before her. The sprawling fields, the solid buildings, the faces of the people who had once doubted her, now softened with acceptance. She had arrived at Sterling Ranch as a stranger, a woman with only her own inner strength to offer. But she had found love, respect, and a profound sense of purpose. And she knew with unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. As she stepped inside, hand in hand with Silas, she knew their journey was far from over. But she also knew that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united and resolute. Partners always.